Somewhere in your kitchen this morning, a small ritual played out that you probably never questioned. A bowl, a spoon, milk poured over toasted flakes of corn. Or perhaps it was toast and jam, or coffee and a pastry, or rice and pickled vegetables. Whatever it was, you likely never asked yourself where it came from, or why it exists at all. Here is the strange truth. For most of human history, breakfast as we know it did not exist. There was no cereal aisle, no orange juice carton, no bacon sizzling in a pan every morning out of habit. For thousands of years, many cultures barely ate anything at all when they woke up. Some considered the very act of eating early in the day to be a sign of gluttony, even a moral failing. Physicians once warned that breakfast could make you sick. Kings sometimes ate less in the morning than their servants did. And yet today, breakfast is called, almost as an unquestioned fact, the most important meal of the day. Billion-dollar industries were built on that phrase. Children were taught to believe it in school. Parents still repeat it without knowing where it came from or whether it is even true. So how did a meal that barely existed become sacred? Who decided that mornings needed cereal, or bacon, or coffee? And why does the answer involve a nephew of Sigmund Freud, a religious health resort in rural Michigan, a war, and one of the most successful manipulation campaigns in the history of advertising? This is the hidden history of breakfast. It is a story about survival, religion, science, empire, propaganda, and the quiet power of habit. And by the end, you may never look at your morning the same way again. It seems like such a small thing, a meal, something so ordinary that we rarely think to ask where it came from. But the story of breakfast touches almost every major force that has shaped the modern world: agriculture, religion, industrialization, colonialism, advertising, and science. Breakfast is also a mirror. It reflects who has power and who does not, who has time and who does not, what a society values and what it fears. In some eras, breakfast was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. In others, it was a necessity forced on the poor by the demands of factory labor. In the 20th century, it became a battlefield for corporations competing to control what an entire nation put in its mouth before 8 in the morning. To understand breakfast is to understand something deeper about how ordinary daily habits are formed, not by nature or necessity alone, but by economics, culture, and, very often, deliberate persuasion. The central questions we will explore are these. When did humans start eating a distinct morning meal? And why did it take so long? Why did so many cultures, for so many centuries, actively discourage eating in the morning? How did the modern idea of breakfast, especially in the West, come to be dominated by cereal, bacon, eggs, and coffee? And is the phrase, "the most important meal of the day," actually rooted in science, or is it one of the most effective marketing slogans ever created? To answer these questions, we have to go back much further than the cereal box. We have to go back to the very beginning of how humans organized their days around food. To understand why breakfast is such a recent invention in its modern form, we first need to understand how ancient and medieval people actually ate. For most of human history, the number of meals in a day was not fixed by custom the way it is now. It was dictated by something far more basic: the availability of food, the demands of labor, and the rhythms of daylight. Hunter-gatherer societies ate when food was found, not on a schedule. Early agricultural societies ate around the demands of the fields, the seasons, and the harvest. In ancient Egypt, laborers building monuments along the Nile ate a light meal of bread and beer early in the working day, simply to have enough energy for hard physical labor. This was not a ceremonial meal. It was fuel, plain and practical, eaten quickly before work began. Ancient Greece offers one of the clearest early examples of a distinct morning meal. The Greeks had a term, akratisma, referring to bread dipped in wine, sometimes accompanied by figs or olives. It was eaten shortly after waking. but it was considered a minor, almost unimportant meal, nothing close to the elaborate breakfasts of later centuries. Rome complicates the picture further. Wealthy Romans often ate very little in the morning, sometimes nothing at all, beyond a piece of bread. The main Roman meal, cena, took place in the afternoon or evening. Some Roman writers even associated eating heavily in the morning with poor discipline. The idea that a person of status should show restraint before midday was deeply embedded in Roman culture. This pattern of a light or skipped morning meal, followed by a larger meal later, was extremely common across much of the ancient and medieval world. And this brings us to one of the most surprising facts in this entire story. For centuries, many European physicians and religious authorities actively opposed eating breakfast. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church emphasized fasting and self-denial as spiritual virtues. Eating too early or too often was sometimes viewed as indulgent, even sinful, unless a person's occupation demanded otherwise. Manual laborers, peasants, and soldiers were generally excused, since their bodies required fuel for the day's labor. But the nobility and clergy, whose work was not physical, were expected to show restraint. Medical opinion of the era reinforced this. Following ideas rooted in ancient Greek medicine, particularly the theory of humors, some physicians believed that the stomach needed time to fully digest the previous night's meal before more food was introduced. Eating too soon, they argued, could disrupt digestion and cause illness. This was not fringe thinking. It appeared in serious medical texts for centuries. So here is the twist that surprises most modern viewers. Breakfast, far from being an ancient, universal human tradition, was for long stretches of history considered unnecessary at best and unhealthy or immoral at worst. Yet the word breakfast itself tells us something important. In English, it literally means to break one's fast, the nightly period of not eating that naturally occurs during sleep. The word implies an interruption of restraint, not a celebration of indulgence. Early breakfasts, when they existed at all, were modest by necessity and by cultural expectation. So when did this begin to change? The answer lies not in a single dramatic discovery, but in a slow, centuries-long transformation driven by something far more powerful than taste: the rise of physical labor schedules tied to the clock, rather than the sun. That transformation would take root first among the working poor, long before it ever reached the tables of the wealthy. And it would take an entirely new kind of society, one built on factories, bells, and shift schedules, to turn breakfast from an occasional necessity into a daily requirement. There was no single explorer who discovered breakfast, no ancient tomb that revealed its origins. Instead, the emergence of breakfast as a fixed daily ritual is a story pieced together by food historians, economic historians, and archaeologists studying shifts in agricultural and industrial labor. The first major shift happened among medieval peasants and laborers. Farm work began at first light and required sustained physical energy. Historical records, including household accounts and monastic diaries, show that laborers were commonly given bread, weak ale, or pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew, before beginning their work in the fields. This was not a leisurely meal. It was quick, functional, and modest. By contrast, the households of the wealthy in medieval and early modern Europe often maintained the older tradition of eating little or nothing until midday. Etiquette and status were tied to restraint. To eat heartily in the morning was, in certain aristocratic circles, seen as a habit of the lower classes, not something to imitate. This class divide around breakfast persisted for centuries. What changed it permanently was the Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century and spreading across Europe and North America through the 19th century. Industrialization utterly restructured how people related to time. Before factories, most people's days were governed by natural light and the rhythms of farm labor, which varied by season. Factories introduced something new: the fixed clock schedule. Workers now had to arrive at a specific hour, work a specific number of hours, and leave at a specific hour, regardless of season or daylight. This single shift had an enormous effect on eating patterns. Workers could no longer eat whenever hunger struck, or take long midday meals at home. They needed sustained energy to survive 12, sometimes 14-hour shifts in dangerous, physically demanding conditions. A quick, substantial meal before the workday began was no longer optional. It became a biological necessity. Historians studying working-class diets in 19th century Britain have found that bread, porridge, and tea became staples of the early morning meal for factory workers. In the United States, a similar shift occurred as agricultural life gave way to industrial and urban labor. The farmhouse breakfast, a hearty meal of eggs, meats, and bread eaten before a long day of physical farm work, became something of a cultural ideal, even as more Americans moved to cities and factory jobs. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. As breakfast became more common and more substantial among working people, digestive health became a growing public concern. Heavy, fatty morning meals, combined with the sedentary and stressful conditions of the growing middle class, contributed to widespread complaints of indigestion, constipation, and general poor health. In the late 19th century, this concern would collide with a growing health reform movement, religious dietary reform, and a small sanitarium in rural Michigan. It is here, in a health institution few people today have heard of, that the modern American breakfast, and eventually much of the modern global breakfast, was truly born. And the man behind it was not a chef or a farmer. He was a physician with radical ideas about the human body, and a brother whose ambition would turn a health treatment into an empire. That story begins at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. In the town of Battle Creek, Michigan, in the late 19th century, stood an institution unlike anything else in America. The Battle Creek Sanitarium was founded under the influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a Christian denomination that placed significant emphasis on health reform, vegetarianism, and abstinence from alcohol, tobacco, and what its followers considered overly stimulating foods. The sanitarium's chief physician was Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg was a serious and, by most historical accounts, a genuinely accomplished physician for his time, though many of his specific theories about digestion and disease would later be discredited or heavily revised by modern medical science. He believed that many illnesses originated in the digestive system, and he was deeply concerned about the effects of the heavy, meat-laden, fried breakfasts common among the American middle and upper classes. Kellogg believed that a bland, easily digestible, plant-based diet could prevent illness and even curb what he considered immoral urges, a belief system tied closely to the Adventist emphasis on bodily discipline. In pursuit of a healthier, easily digestible breakfast food, Kellogg and his brother, Will Keith Kellogg, who managed the business side of the sanitarium, began experimenting with grains. The most famous piece of evidence in this story is not a document or an artifact buried in the ground, but a kitchen accident, one that has become one of the most repeated origin stories in food history. According to accounts from both Kellogg brothers, a batch of boiled wheat was accidentally left to sit for an extended period. Rather than discard it, they ran it through rollers anyway, expecting a solid sheet of dough. Instead, thin, flaky flakes emerged. When toasted, these flakes became crisp, light, and, crucially, easy to digest and simple to mass produce. This accidental discovery would eventually become cornflakes, though wheat flakes came first. The Kellogg brothers had created a completely new category of food, ready-to-eat breakfast cereal. The evidence for what happened next comes from business records, patent filings, and extensive newspaper archives from the early 20th century, and it reveals a fascinating and, at times, contentious history. John Harvey Kellogg viewed the cereal as a medical product, part of a broader health regimen for sanitarium patients. His brother Will saw something else entirely: a massive commercial opportunity. The brothers disagreed sharply and eventually bitterly over the direction of the product. John Harvey wanted to keep sugar out of the cereal, staying true to his health-focused vision. Will believed that adding sugar would make the product far more appealing to ordinary consumers, not just health-conscious patients. This disagreement led to a permanent rift between the brothers. In 1906, Will Keith Kellogg founded his own company, the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, which would eventually become the Kellogg Company, choosing commercial success over his brother's strict health philosophy. Around the same time, a former sanitarium patient named C.W. Post, who had spent time at Battle Creek recovering from health issues, took what he learned there and created his own competing cereal products, including Grape Nuts and Postum, launching the Postum Cereal Company, later General Foods. Post is widely credited by food historians as one of the first to apply aggressive, large-scale advertising techniques specifically to breakfast food, years before Kellogg's company fully embraced the same strategy. Within a remarkably short span, Battle Creek, Michigan, a town most Americans had never heard of, became the epicenter of a new industry that would ultimately reshape breakfast tables not just across America, but eventually around much of the world. But cereal alone did not create the modern breakfast as we know it. Something else was still needed: eggs and bacon. Foods that, surprisingly, were not the default American breakfast until a deliberate, calculated campaign made them so. And uncovering that story requires looking at one of the most influential and ethically controversial figures in the history of advertising. Here is a claim that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. The idea that a proper American breakfast should include bacon and eggs was not simply a natural culinary tradition. It was substantially shaped and arguably created by one of the most influential advertising campaigns of the 20th century. The evidence for this comes primarily from the well-documented career of Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and widely regarded as one of the founding figures of modern public relations. Bernays pioneered techniques that used psychological insight, rather than simple product claims, to shape public behavior and consumer demand on a mass scale. In the 1920s, the Beechnut Packing Company, a major producer of bacon, hired Bernays to help increase declining bacon sales. Rather than simply advertising bacon directly, Bernays took a more indirect and, at the time, revolutionary approach. He reasoned that if he could convince the medical establishment that a hearty breakfast was healthier than a light one, bacon sales would rise as a natural consequence, without appearing to be driven by advertising at all. According to Bernays' own later writings and accounts documented by historians of advertising, his team surveyed physicians and asked whether they agreed that a hearty breakfast was healthier than a light one. A significant number of physicians agreed, reflecting genuine, if simplistic, medical thinking of the era about energy needs after an overnight fast. Bernays then publicized these physician endorsements widely in newspapers across the country, framing a substantial breakfast, one that conveniently included bacon and eggs, as a doctor-recommended health practice. It is important, in the interest of historical accuracy, to note what this evidence does and does not show. It does not show that doctors were bribed or that the survey was outright falsified. Historians who have examined this case generally agree that Bernays skillfully leveraged real, if general, medical opinion and reframed it to serve a specific commercial interest, associating a general recommendation for a substantial breakfast with the specific promotion of bacon and eggs. This is widely cited by historians of advertising and public relations as one of the earliest and most effective examples of using manufactured public consensus, sometimes now referred to by the more modern term astroturfing, to shift consumer behavior. The campaign is widely credited in numerous food and advertising histories, with playing a significant role in cementing bacon and eggs as the quintessential American breakfast, a status the meal still largely holds today, roughly a century later. This raises an unsettling but important question that runs through this entire documentary. How much of what we consider traditional about our daily habits is actually organic cultural evolution, and how much is the result of deliberate, well-funded persuasion? Bernays himself would go on to apply similar psychological and public relations techniques to convince American women that smoking was a symbol of liberation and independence, a campaign now widely studied and widely criticized as an example of using psychological manipulation for commercial ends, unrelated to the actual product's health effects. The story of bacon and eggs, then, is not simply a story about food. It is a case study in how the modern advertising industry learned to shape not just what products people buy, but the everyday rituals and beliefs people come to treat as timeless tradition, without most people ever realizing intervention had occurred at all. But the persuasion campaigns did not stop with bacon. Orange juice, coffee, and even the very phrase, most important meal of the day, all have their own surprising, and sometimes surprisingly recent, origin stories. And that leads us into one of the most contested areas of this entire history: the leading theories about why breakfast holds the cultural and scientific status it does today. The phrase is so familiar that most people have never questioned it. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. It is repeated by parents, taught in early schooling, and printed on cereal boxes. But where did this specific claim come from? And how much of it holds up to modern scientific scrutiny? This is genuinely contested territory among historians and nutrition scientists, and it deserves to be treated as such. Theory 1. The marketing origin theory. A substantial body of food historians and journalists argue that the phrase, in its modern popular form, gained widespread traction primarily through cereal industry advertising in the early to mid-20th century, particularly from companies like Kellogg's and General Foods, the descendant of C.W. Post's company. These companies had an obvious commercial incentive to promote breakfast, and specifically cereal-based breakfast, as not just enjoyable, but medically essential. The supporting evidence for this theory includes extensive advertising archives showing breakfast cereal companies directly funding and promoting nutritional research, sponsoring school health curricula that emphasized breakfast's importance, and running national ad campaigns using health-based claims well before rigorous, independent scientific consensus existed on the topic. The weakness in this theory, which fair-minded historians acknowledge, is that it can be easy to overstate. Concern about the importance of a morning meal existed among some physicians and nutritionists before the cereal industry became powerful, particularly regarding manual laborers and children. The marketing theory does not claim breakfast concern was invented from nothing, only that it was significantly amplified, commercialized, and popularized far beyond what the actual science at the time supported. Theory 2. The genuine physiological basis theory. A separate group of nutrition scientists argues that there is a real, biologically grounded rationale for why eating in the morning matters for many people, separate from any marketing influence. After roughly 8 to 12 hours without food during sleep, blood glucose levels are naturally lower. For children especially, numerous peer-reviewed studies conducted from the 1990s onward have shown associations between eating breakfast and improved concentration, memory, and classroom behavior. The supporting evidence here includes multiple independent, non-industry-funded studies on children's cognitive performance, though it is worth being precise about what these studies actually show. An association between breakfast consumption and improved test performance in children, not necessarily an equally strong effect in all adult populations. The weakness in this theory, which nutrition scientists themselves openly acknowledge, is that a great deal of the 20th century research specifically on breakfast in adults was directly funded by cereal and food companies including Kellogg's, General Mills, and Quaker Oats, raising well-documented concerns about industry-funded research bias. This does not automatically make the findings false, but it does mean the research requires independent replication and careful scrutiny, which has not always been consistently applied throughout the 20th century. Theory 3. The modern reassessment theory. In the past 2 decades, a growing body of more rigorous, independently funded nutritional research has begun to seriously challenge the blanket claim that breakfast is universally essential for adults. Several controlled studies published in respected journals in the 2010s, including research examining breakfast skipping and weight management, found no consistent evidence that skipping breakfast leads to weight gain or worse health outcomes in adults, directly contradicting decades of popular assumption. This has coincided with the rise of intermittent fasting as a mainstream dietary practice, in which many adults deliberately skip breakfast as part of a structured eating pattern, with some studies suggesting potential metabolic benefits for certain individuals. Though long-term research is still ongoing, and results are genuinely mixed depending on the population studied and the specific fasting protocol used. It is essential to be clear here in the interest of accuracy. This does not mean breakfast is unhealthy, nor does it mean the older research was entirely wrong. It means the scientific consensus has shifted from a fairly absolute one-size-fits-all claim toward a more nuanced understanding that the ideal eating pattern likely varies significantly based on an individual's age, activity level, metabolic health, and personal circumstances. Reputable nutrition scientists today generally avoid the blanket, unqualified claim that breakfast is essential for every single person, even as many still recommend it for specific groups, including children and certain individuals managing particular health conditions. So, which theory is correct? The honest answer, and the one that best reflects the current state of evidence, is that all three contain some truth. The marketing industry undeniably amplified and commercialized breakfast culture for profit. Genuine physiological benefits do exist for many people, particularly children, and modern science has meaningfully complicated the simple, absolute version of the claim that dominated the 20th century. What remains unresolved, and what nutrition researchers continue to actively study, is exactly how much of our cultural certainty about breakfast reflects sound, unbiased science, and how much reflects a century of extremely effective advertising that shaped both public belief and, ultimately, the direction of the research itself. This is not a fringe or conspiratorial claim. It is a documented concern raised repeatedly within the nutrition science community itself regarding industry-funded research more broadly. This uncertainty leads us directly into a fascinating question. If so much of what we think we know about breakfast is a product of modern industry and Western culture, what did breakfast actually look like in the rest of the world, in places untouched by Kellogg's, Bernays, and American advertising? The answer reveals just how culturally constructed our entire idea of a normal breakfast really is. If breakfast were a natural biological necessity in one specific form, we would expect to see roughly similar morning meals across all human cultures. Instead, the archaeological, historical, and anthropological record shows something quite different. Enormous variation, shaped entirely by local agriculture, climate, religion, and available resources. In much of East Asia, particularly in China, breakfast has traditionally centered on congee, a warm, savory rice porridge, often accompanied by pickled vegetables, salted eggs, or fried dough sticks known as youtiao. This tradition stretches back centuries and reflects the centrality of rice as a staple crop, along with a broader East Asian culinary preference for warm, savory morning meals rather than the sweet cereals and pastries common in the West. In Japan, a traditional breakfast historically included steamed rice, miso soup, grilled fish, and pickled vegetables, a meal built around balance and umami flavor rather than sweetness. This traditional pattern remained dominant for centuries, though Western-style breakfasts, including bread and coffee, have become increasingly common in urban Japan since the 20th century, itself a reflection of the same global spread of Western food marketing discussed earlier in this documentary. In India, breakfast traditions vary enormously by region, reflecting the country's vast cultural and linguistic diversity. In the South, meals often include idli, steamed rice cakes, or dosa, a fermented rice and lentil crepe, typically served with sambar and chutney. In the North, options like paratha, a layered flatbread, often stuffed and served with yogurt or pickle, are common. These dishes reflect centuries of regional agricultural practice and culinary development entirely independent of Western breakfast history. In parts of the Middle East, a traditional breakfast might include foods such as ful medams, a dish of stewed fava beans, alongside flatbread, olive oil, and cheese, a tradition with roots stretching back to ancient Egypt, connecting modern breakfast tables to some of the oldest agricultural civilizations on Earth. In Mexico, traditional breakfasts often include dishes such as chilaquiles, fried tortilla pieces simmered in salsa, or huevos rancheros, fried eggs served over tortillas with tomato-based sauce, reflecting the deep culinary role of corn, a staple crop in Mesoamerica for thousands of years, long before European contact. Even within Europe, breakfast varies dramatically. The traditional English breakfast, featuring eggs, bacon, sausages, baked beans, and toast, stands in sharp contrast to the so-called continental breakfast common in France and much of southern Europe, typically consisting of little more than bread, butter, jam, and coffee. This difference itself is historically rooted, reflecting different regional attitudes toward morning eating, agricultural traditions, and, in the case of the elaborate English breakfast, its own particular history tied to Victorian-era country house culture and the demands of physical agricultural labor among the British working class. What this global survey reveals is something crucial to the entire story of this documentary. There is no single, universal, biologically mandated form that breakfast must take. Every version of breakfast eaten around the world today is the product of specific historical, agricultural, religious, and, increasingly, commercial forces. The idea of a single correct breakfast, one built around cereal, or eggs and bacon, or coffee, is a relatively recent and largely Western cultural construction, one that has been exported globally through trade, colonialism, and, as we've seen, deliberate corporate marketing throughout the 20th century. This global diversity raises a final pressing question. In the age of satellites, genetic research, and digital data, what does modern science actually tell us, free from a century of advertising influence, about how humans should eat in the morning, if at all? The answer takes us into the cutting edge of contemporary nutrition research. In recent decades, researchers have applied increasingly rigorous scientific methods, including large-scale randomized controlled trials, to questions that were, for most of the 20th century, dominated by industry-funded studies and cultural assumption rather than solid evidence. One of the most significant developments has been research into circadian rhythms, the internal biological clocks that regulate processes throughout the human body, including metabolism. Researchers studying chrononutrition, a relatively new field examining how the timing of meals affects health, have found evidence suggesting that when a person eats may matter almost as much as what they eat. Some studies indicate that eating earlier in the day may align better with natural insulin sensitivity patterns for many people, lending some support to the value of a morning meal. Though researchers are careful to note this research is still developing and effects vary between individuals. At the same time, large-scale studies on intermittent fasting, including time-restricted eating patterns where individuals consume all their daily food within a specific window, often skipping breakfast entirely, have produced genuinely mixed results. Some studies suggest metabolic benefits for certain individuals, particularly those managing insulin resistance or seeking weight management. Other studies have found no significant difference in health outcomes between breakfast eaters and breakfast skippers when total daily calorie intake is controlled for. This is an active, evolving area of research, and nutrition scientists themselves openly acknowledge that a single universal recommendation likely does not exist. Genetic and microbiome research has added another layer of complexity. Studies examining the gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in the human digestive system, suggest that individual responses to meal timing can vary significantly based on a person's unique microbial composition, meaning what works well for one individual's metabolism may not work the same way for another. This has led some researchers to caution against the kind of one-size-fits-all breakfast advice that dominated 20th century nutritional guidance. Historians and food researchers have also turned modern analytical tools toward the past itself. Archaeobotanists, scientists who study ancient plant remains, have used residue analysis on ancient pottery to identify traces of grains, dairy, and other foods, helping confirm historical accounts of what early morning meals, when they existed, actually consisted of. Isotopic analysis of ancient human remains has also allowed researchers to estimate dietary patterns of populations going back thousands of years, offering scientific confirmation and occasionally correction of historical assumptions about ancient eating habits. Meanwhile, food historians have continued to dig through corporate archives, newspaper records, and advertising materials from the early 20th century, and this ongoing archival research continues to refine our understanding of exactly how much of modern breakfast culture was shaped by deliberate commercial strategy versus organic cultural evolution. This remains an active and evolving area of historical research, not a fully closed case. What emerges from all of this modern research is a picture far more nuanced than either the confident breakfast is essential messaging of the 20th century or a simple dismissal of breakfast as pure marketing myth. The truth appears to sit somewhere in between. Breakfast can offer real benefits for many people, particularly children and certain metabolic profiles, but it is not the universal one-size-fits-all necessity that a century of advertising confidently claimed it to be. This brings us to perhaps the most important question of this entire documentary. If so much of our daily ritual was shaped by forces we never fully recognized, what does that tell us about ourselves? And why does this story matter beyond the breakfast table? At first glance, the history of breakfast might seem like a light-hearted curiosity, an amusing bit of trivia to share at a dinner party. But look closer, and this story reveals something much larger about how modern life actually works. The history of breakfast is, in many ways, a history of how industrialization reshaped the human body's relationship with time itself. Before factories and clocks, humans ate according to hunger, availability, and the rhythms of the sun.